Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats.
All right, welcome everybody. We've got another take inventory. For a reminder for folks who didn't see the first episode, I don't know the topic that we're going to be debating today, but I've invited a couple friends of mine on to have that debate. Ari is going to be my opponent in the debate, who's brought both a topic and a take. And then Tom is going to be the adjudicator here. He's going to decide which arguments were convincing and ultimately who won. I mean, what's his take on the issue coming out of this after we've both explained where we're coming from. So Ari, you as the guest, you'll get the first word and the last word on the topic. So take as much time or as little as you see fit explaining sort of what the topic is and what your take is.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll lead in, and you're probably the perfect person to take the opposite side of this debate because you are a competitive player turned pretty heavy into cedh. And I think some of the recent set releases really turned me in this direction, which is that I don't actually think that the biggest design issue facing Magic today is not how to handle reprint set or universes beyond. Like, all this stuff is nonsense. The real issue facing the design team that they have not yet to resolve, but I'm really unsure is resolvable, is that designing for 1v1 and designing for multiplayer games at the same time within the Magic game engine is potentially not possible. I want to say this is not a bash on cedh, because I think a lot of that format works because of the issues I'm describing that are hitting 1v1 Magic. And I'm not criticizing the idea of designing for multiplayer because it's clearly a very good idea these days. And I guess to set the basis of this, if you look back at the design of like Alpha, a lot of that is sort of exploring the physical things that you can do with cards. So there's a lot of things that are absolutely abhorrent that are just exploring, we've created a game engine, what happens if stasis is in play? And about 20 to 25 years of Magic design went into saying, don't put a stasis into any of your sets. This is stupid. We're going to put this style of card in. And then we sort of hit the like throne of Eldraine and forward era of design, where that just isn't true, and things are designed on a different axis than that, in part because of a desire for, I think, power creep, and in part because I think a desire to hit multiplayer. And to sort of like basis why there's this incongruency is that the resource situation of what you're actually doing on a turn-by-turn basis is not the same. You are effectively in a multiplayer game playing against 3 opponents worth of draws and untapped steps every single turn. So if you had to compete against an opponent in 1v1 who had 3 turns worth of untapped steps and 3 turns worth of draw steps every single turn, the game would be a little different. So you end up printing cards that create this scenario where you can spend a turn in multiplayer that feels okay against that. And then when you translate that back into 1v1 games, you have some really skewed and really big issues. And this also relates to the whole joke about like, oh, why don't Commander players just play Doomblade? It's because you can't, because it's the same, if you trade your draw step for one of the 3 opposing draw steps, that's really bad. Or like your mana for one of the 3 opposing, untapped steps, that's not great. So if you want to fire back with anything, I can, let you take its stance, or I can get into sort of the micro resources that are sort of getting conflicted here.
I appreciate the clear presentation of that side of it. I think I understand what you're saying, and to the extent I don't, you'll have a chance to clarify when I respond, what I've missed and what I messed up. So my initial reaction, I think you're sort of not giving credit to the vastness of the design space in Magic and the idea that targets that are difficult to hit aren't impossible to hit, and also the cost of missing not being that great. So let me take each of those in turn. So first of all, the vastness of the design space, think of a Venn diagram between cards that are hits in 1v1 and cards that are hits in multiplayer, and think about the overlap, of course, being that sweet spot where maybe an entire set or a huge chunk of a set can actually appeal to different types of players. As the design space gets vast enough in a game that has those different sorts of competing objectives, but things that can overlap, I think hopefully we can all agree that it is possible to design a card that hits both. Well, if the space is vast enough, you're going to see, yes, a ton of the Venn diagram that doesn't hit both on each side, but also a significant overlap that you can hit. And so when I play cedh, a number of the cards I needed when I went and started my cedh collection were pulled straight out of the Legacy box, straight out of the Modern box, straight out of the Pioneer box. And so, and why is that? It's because there is a significant overlap. And so each of those cards that I had to pull from those collections, and I left 3 in the Legacy box and pulled 1, because you can only play 1 copy instead of 4. Well, when I did that, it was a huge overlap. And that's because there is a lot of hits in both. I mean, some of it's just on pure strength, and obviously like in normal EDH, it's not quite as overlapping because your 7 mana, 8 mana dinosaur is not going to be great in Legacy, but it might be awesome in EDH. So, I mean, I get all that. But then again, okay, even just now that I said that, as I was saying that, I'm thinking of a dinosaur. Was it Italy or Italy, the supermarket restaurant? That giant dinosaur, it's actually pretty good in casual EDH and cedh and construct and standard. But long story short, I think there's a vast design space that provides plenty of overlap and a big target that you can hit and plenty of room in that dartboard. Second of all, the cost when you miss. So if you release a set and only 10% of the cards are a smashing success in both multiplayer and 1v1, leaving 90% only successful in limited or constructed 60 player or a 60 card or constructed 100 card. Well, is it that disastrous, right? I mean, has the city been ransacked in that case because you didn't necessarily have 100%? I don't know that it is. I mean, you have enough to satisfy everybody. Plus, you do have that subset of cards that keeps players engaged on multiple axes. And I think that's actually how this has played out in those Eldraine and Beyond sets. Yeah, you've got some cards that are too strong for 60 card constructed because they're aimed elsewhere on all that. I mean, you have some issues, but that's more of an implementation issue that if you can iterate on that, you'll fix it, than it is like a fundamental problem. So I think set size gives you some wiggle room, and the fact that not every card has to hit everywhere. So that's my initial reaction, is just sort of that. Yeah, if every card had to be a smash hit in EDH, cedh, Legacy, I mean, same thing, Legacy, Standard, Limited, you wouldn't be able to necessarily hit that. But I don't look at it that way. I look at, some cards in the common slot, the 4/4 for 5 that draws a card. Yeah, maybe that's just supposed to make draft a little bit more interesting. And then maybe that 9 mana dinosaur is supposed to make casual EDH more interesting. But maybe if it had slightly different abilities, it would make even competitive EDH more interesting. Or if it's a Traxa, even 60 card formats become super impacted by it. So that's how I look at it. And I don't view these as so cannibalistic in their goals among these different objectives that you can't hit both or a multiple of these objectives.
Okay. So let me fire back with 2 things I kind of thought about, which is I think that there is a natural push to accidentally or semi-purposefully that Venn diagram shifts into a zone where it is very hard to create cards that are EDH interesting, exciting, multiplayer interesting, exciting, without them sort of eclipsing the constructed space. And I think that sort of has to do with the fact that Rule 0 in a large scale is kind of a failure. I think that it's really easy to say, I don't want a specific one-of card that exists. Like, we're going to play this, 1v1, and we're not going to have an infinite combo in this, 4-player game. We're not going to have a Soul Ring. But I think that it doesn't fight against the idea of broader power creep in games, which tends to push those cards that, you're talking about. It's like, oh, we make an EDH card that's a giant dinosaur. That kind of ends up getting pushed into the constructed realm naturally because of how it has to compete against everything that exists. Because the other option is that you start having people nitpicking, 8,000 things at their table, and that just doesn't work in the social side. And telling someone sitting down that they can't do something that is, they want to do is hard. And it's hard enough when it's just okay, well, this is just in the free contact off the shelf or whatever. It's really hard when you start having to Rule 0 30% of the rares because you think that you want to keep things within your like brushwags versus oofs theme decks range. And the idea that this can get outsourced to the player groups, I think that is a good idea in theory, but in practice, it's kind of just shirking the burden of making decisions to every single person. And from there, you kind of end up in this spot where you kind of have to design all these cards for the whole game. And you end up in two spots where it's actually, double-sided, where one, you actually, because of like the things that are exciting in EDH and what I was talking about with like, we're designing cards for a multiplayer environment where the resource economy is just different. You end up with things like you have put Cascade back into standard, which I don't really have a huge issue with any of the Discover's cards specifically, but that points to like a broader trend where if you look at the way cards have been printed, drawing cards and then spending mana on those cards is just not a profitable thing to do in constructed Magic anymore. And I think a lot of that falls on the feet of like trying to design cards for this thing where if you draw cards and you wait a turn cycle to spend mana on them, there have been 3 turns in the middle, 4 turns in the middle, and that just doesn't work. And then on the other side of this, you end up with a lot of stuff where you can print a card and you put that synergy card, like a synergy-based card. I'll point to like a lot of the random dinosaurs in the Ixalan set, like the 2-mana raptor that gets power equal to the dinosaur you play, or whatever it does. You end up putting them into this isolated environment, and you're like, okay, well, someone's going to want this for their 100-card deck. But you don't put enough support into it, into more constrained constructed formats. And that just like doesn't work. You see a lot of this repeatedly over the last few years of design where a lot of cards are created where there's just no way for the cards to exist to support them across X number of sets, just because there's no need or incentive to in a lot of spots, because within the context of the broader scope of Magic, you could probably find a cleric, a rogue, a warrior, etc. within the last 2 blocks, a little dicier. There's also like a very small effect in here where you talk about this Venn diagram. I actually think the Venn diagram on effect redundancy for constructed in EDH is pretty divergent, where you I'd point to like Force of Negation, I feel like is actually like adding these extra free spells to CEDH is actually really, really good for the metagame, the format there, because having more reliable ways to have interaction in a way that, again, doesn't break this, 3v1 untapped paradigm, really important for that format. But adding a critical density of free spells to a format where you get to play 4 of them actually has a lot of huge issues. And there's a lot of smaller versions of this exact same overlap where I think that another example might be just like the sheer density of like a braid or like abrupt decay style effects that have shifted into like leyline binding, similar things where like, oh, we need to create an answer for XYZ in this range, and then also sort of have to concede to having a little bit more in case of like color identity issues, cutting someone out of that. And then when you get to constructed, you start to have this overwhelming thing of like, there's no point in card types. Like it's all just raw rates and efficiency just because you have access to like more than enough of whatever you need. I think that makes this idea of you design for one and it's okay for the other really hard. Again, just because it's very hard to design continuously in a way that keeps those circles overlapping without causing these issues, or not overlapping. Keep these, the Venn diagram distinct without causing those issues.
Okay, so some fair points in there, but I think a clear direction I would take my response, and that's, look, the power creep issues are real. I mean, you're talking to someone who created a video, I think it was in 2019, about sort of how, I think it's my most viewed video ever for me on YouTube, how power creep became the story of 2019, all about power creep. And at that time I wasn't even playing multiplayer Magic, and it's only gotten worse since then. So I think that's the issue of power creep, and how the dynamics you're describing impact the way new cards sort of have to be printed in order to sell the packs, and then the impact they have on the older cards. I think that's real, but let's now attribute that to its problem. The source of that problem. Is it the tension between printing for Commander or multiplayer and printing for 1v1 or competitive constructed? So I think to test that theory, I'd say, okay, well, let's look at whether Commander Legends created more issues than Modern Horizons 2. And I think, like, if you look at that even for a moment, it's crystal clear to me that these are distinct problems, and that the relationship really isn't causal. if you look at Modern Horizons 1 and Modern Horizons 2, I mean, nothing has had more of a clear, demonstrable, and sizable power creep impact on every competitive format where these cards are legal. And these sets were aimed at 60-card competitive 1v1 formats, but those problems that you mentioned were within the set file and within the principles that led to that set design, and they permeate throughout how everything's adjusted and what's acceptable and what's not, and what's going to push a boundary in order to make this product really enticing. I think that's what's really going on. And because that provides sort of an experiment for us to look at, a set that was designed for Commander, like Commander Legends or whatever the set that, I mean, I don't think I'm confusing Commander Masters and Commander Legends, but one of those sets that was designed that way with new cards in it, and Modern Horizons 1 and 2, I just think it's very clear that that's not what's going on. Instead, what's going on is that, look, if I want people to buy my packs, I gotta put a card in there that gets your blood pumping, even though you've seen the last 25 years of cards that we've designed, whether I'm designing for Legacy, I'm designing for Modern, even when I'm designing for Standard and trying to hit all these targets at once, because that's what I'm trying to do with my main set releases. So yeah, I mean, maybe a little bit of it is like, well, if someone at WOTC is laser focused only on Commander, they're going to have certain blind spots, and that can lead these power creep issues. I just don't think that's really in the driver's seat. And nothing's been worse than Modern Horizons 2, for example. And again, a set that's clearly aimed where it's aimed and had the problems where it had the problems. So if we snap our fingers and eliminate multiplayer Magic tomorrow like that, well, I don't think that goes away. I think the next set is going to have that same issue. The Modern Horizons 3 is going to have that issue. They're going to try to make the card that slots into blue-red tempo decks, and how are they? They're going to have to make it really strong in order for it to slot into those decks, and even if multiplayer Magic didn't exist.
Okay. Well, I'm going to fire back with, I actually think Modern Horizons 2 was a net positive for Modern, at least, and possibly a lot of other formats. I actually think that Modern, before that set was released, was borderline unplayable. And it took until about now, and there's a lot of other compounding issues I don't want to start on, that have made it bad. And we had a solid 2 years in the middle there, where Modern Horizons 2 was basically the best thing that happened to Modern gameplay in a long time. And I think this, again, points back to another issue with design for multiplayer, which is that Modern Horizons 2 was the first set where we were basically given cards that were allowed to be good attrition, good exchange in 1v1 Magic. Cards that just, again, cedh, completely different thing. Like you're allowed to put Subtlety or Grief into your cedh deck for the purpose of not dying. But in general multiplayer, those cards just don't really exist, and they don't you can't put them into your deck. And you have this problem where I think that there's twofold issue. One is that, and then the other is that because of the card economy and all of that, is you end up in a spot where the worst thing that could happen in a multiplayer game is one player doesn't have cards to play and the others do, because one of two things happens. Either they're stuck in the game waiting for someone to end the game, or they're done with the game and they're waiting on the other three players to be done to start a new game. It's really bad. Whereas in 1v1, if you just lose all your, it's the classic control thing where if there's all this dead air time, but realistically at the end of the day, if you are playing 1v1 and you have nothing, your opponent has 7 cards and you're kind of locked out of the game by a barrage of extra resources, you can just be done and go to the next game. That's a fine solution generally. So I think that in general, Modern Horizons 2 is a sort of exception to that design philosophy where the cards were designed with the intent of no one ever playing them in a multiplayer environment. And those are actually the better pieces of that.
So do you think Ragavan's a popular card in multiplayer?
I would assume no, but I could be wrong there. It does have the saboteur effect where you get to attack someone at every turn and generate treasure. So it's hard for me personally to judge what is, I have some thread on cedh, but you ask someone what's popular in EDH, and that's a different data science.
Well, yeah, and I mean, obviously, that's not, that's not the goal of the debate is not to quiz you on what cards are popular in Commander. So forgive me for that. But I think what I'm trying to demonstrate is just that, Ragavan is actually pretty popular, and it's fun. I mean, it does something really powerful in 1v1, but to the extent that multiplayer is about having fun and then finding those payoffs that for whatever reason scale with the kind of fun you're trying to have. Now, Ragavan scales in cedh because it's low investment and actually like pretty high output because it's generating mana in form of treasures and you can hit stuff. But then it's also, in casual, you have this cool, like, I hit your thing and it's like a pirate and it's a monkey. So it's actually a popular card. And so I think for me, again, it takes me back to my initial first argument I made about the Venn diagram. And you can look at, so there's a danger in getting too compartmentalized in how we think about the designs and realizing Ragavan had such a big impact on Constructed. It's not even legal in all the Constructed formats anymore because it has such a big impact and it continues to have such a big impact. And yet it's also it's a big success, I think, in multiplayer Magic because of just what it does and how it does it. And so, yeah, like that target to some extent it gets narrower over time because of power creep, because you have to sort of do something novel and it's got to be at the right rate to make its way into your deck if you're in a game that cares about rate. But there's a lot of cards that hit that. So I don't know. I just again feel like the tension is sort of real to the extent that it makes designing more difficult, but impossible, which is the way you framed your take. I just think it's not close to that. And I think that certain cards and certain sets of cards and certain trends in cards sort of demonstrate that difficult does not mean impossible. And you can hit that target with smart, clever designs that are flavorful, that are powerful, that are resonant, that actually scale in interesting ways in multiplayer. Like Ragavan came to mind first, so I mentioned him first. And I guess maybe Italy came that other dinosaur came to mind as well. Those types of cards, these are examples of cards that really have hit those multiple objective targets. And I just don't see a lot of evidence that because, I'm aiming in a certain place for multiplayer, I can't get there without totally screwing up the 1v1 environment just because it's difficult. Like Shieldred, for example, I mean, that's a card that maybe it's like a little bit too strong for 1v1 formats, because like they wanted to turn the knob a certain way for multiplayer. But okay, to the extent that they missed with the One Ring or they missed with shoulders, but that's just like a matter of like, they weren't quite skilled enough at turning the knobs. But that's not impossible. It's not impossible to design the One Ring that's maybe worded a little differently, and maybe it hits that target a little better. So hopefully that sort of clarifies where I'm at, that difficult does not mean impossible. And even if we agree that the One Ring was a miss, doesn't mean, you're not compelled to print the One Ring every set.
I think you almost are. I think that Shieldred is a good example of this. I think Shieldred is, you say it might be too far. That card is like perfectly spot on in every single way. They've made one Shieldred level card in like how many years? Like, you are averaging one Shieldred level card worth of like, this is like a perfect spot for like, is this dynamic in 1v1? Is this dynamic in multiplayer? Is it like, does it let players sort of dream bigger than what the card is on its face while offering a decent value as face value? I think that for every Shieldred, you could probably create, point to 10 plus examples of cards that actually do create problems on one side or the other. Again, pointing back to this idea of like, cascading advantages on the battlefield. For every Shieldred, there's a card that makes a goober token that does something else that really does nothing besides produce a unit and another unit of value. And again, push this game towards this continuance game plan that is, I think, just generally not good for 1v1. These kinds of games that are, grinding out on the clock, where players are digging for 8,000 types of tokens and just like, no one really knows how they're winning, except for then every deck becomes like, there's one most efficient mid-range deck, and then there's some combo deck that maybe tries to beat it, and then like there's a hybrid mid-range combo deck. I think that sort of strategy homogenization is a result of the difficulty of designing when you're outputting, a 300 card set, every format's like, ignore all the extra like supplemental stuff. You can argue about pace. Like, we're talking just on the like 25-year pace of Magic releases. I don't know if you can release 1,000 to 1,200 cards a year that hit on the marks of Shieldred or Ragavan as these broad winners. And I think you just end up with failures if you have to produce at reasonable volume, let alone, excessive volume.
Okay, fair enough. I think I understand your position. I think I've made mine. I'm going to give you an opportunity. And if what you just said is a proper summation of your take, then we can let that stand. But if you'd like the last word and a different set of last words, the floor is yours. And then we're going to turn it over to Tom to give us his impression of what he's ultimately convinced by. But please, again, feel free to sum up or just take us home.
No, I'm with you. I think we naturally summed up everything. I had an outline of the different points I was going to make, and it kind of just, back and forth naturally went through all of them. So again, I think the resource position of Magic is a game. You can either design cards that fit 1v1, you can design cards that fit multiplayer, but designing both at the same time in, the way that they are printed now is kind of an impossible task.
Okay, Tom, take your time if you still write down your notes and gather your thoughts. But
I'm having flashbacks to judging Lincoln Douglas debate in college. I have like 5 frantic lines. I've forgotten most of my shorthand, so I'm sitting here actually trying to write out words. And so bear with me if I jump around a little bit. So my first thought was that this thesis statement is very, very, very hard for Ari to win. He set himself up here with borderline. Again, use the word impossible as like borderline impossible to validate. So I will give it a little bit of a softening just for the interest of like making this useful, but I think prohibitively difficult, let's say, so I'll go with that. One thing that got touched on real fast. So yep.
I did specifically use the word impossible because I wanted to give an opening for if there's a solution that someone wants to field and they defeat my argument with that, I'm very willing to listen to that.
Okay, then I will maintain the standard of impossibility.
No, I was going with the leniency.
Nope. You've convinced me to go back to it. I will add a quick aside. This got touched on really briefly, and neither of you went into it, which I think is good because it's not germane to the topic, but asking like, why do you need to do this? Right? Which I think is a natural sidestepping of this question. Like, do you have to even do this? That's an interesting fault discussion. It got touched on tiny little bit here. Well, as an example, like you could just make the commander sets not playable in Legacy, right? And then all of a sudden it fixes this problem almost. And then now you have a dedicated release point you can use. We didn't get into that very deeply because it's not germane to the topic. So I think you both did a good job of dodging that kind of red herring. I think the Venn diagram model is very useful as a framework for thinking about this, right? Which of the buckets of design space is a card being put into? Is it being designed for one of them? Is it being designed for multiple? And another kind of framework to add to that for me is like, even if it's designed for one, does it flow to another? Is also very useful to understand this, right? And the key question here, I think, becomes, are you designing cards either that are intentionally designed for both at the same time, or are you designing cards that are flowing back and forth between the spaces, right? We have infinite examples of cards flowing from 1v1 to Commander. Matt's first point of like, when he built his collection, he pulled a bunch of cards that were printed prior to Wilds of Eldraine out of 1v1 boxes for Legacy and other formats to seed his collection for cedh. Clearly, you have powerful cards from history that were designed exclusively for 1v1 that do make an impact in the cedh space. But can you design cards specifically that are for cedh or EDH, either one, and do those ever flow back the other way in a healthy way, or do those break the underlying kind of backflow of 1v1? I think it's a kind of an important kind of question here. Because we're hinged on impossibility of future design, and Matt's point also, like, design space is vast, maybe infinite, maybe pseudo-infinite. Have we just not done it well yet? Or, is there really no way to ever do it? I think is, again, why it's so hard to prove impossibility here. Which is why I think that you need to kind of engage with it on a theoretical stance. Ari touched on this a little bit. I would have loved to see this kind of expanded on of like power creep. Obviously a huge part of this. Over time, over the next 10, 20, 50 years of designing cards in this space, where if you're trying to do both in the same sets, you're going to have power creep within each format. What does power creep in EDH look like compared to what does power creep look like in 1v1 Magic? Do they follow the same axes or do they go in different ways? Ari touches, we talks about how like in EDH, you have to design withstanding 3 untaps and 3 sets of mana from your opponents, right? So cards need to do something fundamentally different than a card in 1v1, which just has to survive one turn cycle of one player, and then you get to kind of use that piece. But I think expanding on this more is kind of one of his best arguments for like, as you power creep the axis that lets you withstand EDH formats and cedh formats, those dimensions of power creep, many of those will break 1v1 Magic. Whereas if you power creep in 1v1 Magic, it'll always almost by definition be fine in EDH. And I think that Modern Horizons 2 is a good argument of this, right? It was a good example of power creeping along a 1v1 dimension just can't really break multiplayer Magic.
Not always. Like Fast as Oracle is a good counterexample. With Fast as Oracle, it gives you a hoop to jump through. It says you win the game, and you win the game is actually like 4 times like it's a multiple more powerful. But sorry, continue though.
Yeah. I think the sliver of maybe win the game explicitly has 4x the or 3x the importance.
Right.
That's kind of like that one narrow thing. But I think under almost basically every other version of, but I think it's a good call. There is some example of power creep 1v1 that could also still break EDH in a more impactful way. So I thought like exploring that more of like what is the actual, again, design is theoretical. I'm going to theoretically design a bunch of cards the next 30 years. Why is it that I can't keep power creeping? What are the dimensions of power creep within EDH that do break 1v1? What have we seen so far? And we're going to keep seeing more and more of, right? And how do you establish that they have to kind of go down this road? Can't they just avoid that path? And I think for me, this is something I was thinking about. An example is even just the maturation of EDH, right? Like 10 years ago, the EDH cards were like all 7 mana, 9 mana, 10 mana creatures, right? Like Sylvan Primordial was banned in EDH, right? Like no one ever is going to care about what you can do whatever you want on an 8 mana creature basically in Magic and not break it, right? Barring like making it free or making it free to cast. Even if you can make it not reanimatable. Like you can do whatever there. But as EDH cards, CEDH, I'm not sure they designed for CEDH so much, but as EDH cards have gone down the curve of like, well, we want games to be interesting before turn 7 or 8. We don't want everyone to be sitting here playing lands for 6 turns. Now you're going to inherently kind of run into the space of 1-1 constructed. That's already happened, right? That's why we've hit this kind of point of contention already. You're seeing cards that have to happen earlier in the game. Is this inevitable? Was this going to keep going? So I'd like to see exploring kind of that and establishing this must happen, right? Because again, for your thesis of it's impossible to do this, you have to show, I think, that it must go down this path or an equivalent path that makes them run each other more and more. They certainly are running each other more and more, but does it have to keep happening? And I think also just more examples. I think you could strengthen the argument with some examples of cards that kind of fit in each box and move around. I think the Ragavan example was great for this. The Atali example also great. Atali is a card that I don't know which one it is. I assume it's designed for EDH, but it's playable and constructed. It's actually, I think, a healthy card in 1v1 Magic. Ragavan, a card that's clearly designed for 1v1. A healthy card in EDH, a fun card to go both ways. Where are the cards that are causing the problems? You touch on Shieldred, but are there other cards, other mechanics that really break this? And then I think decomposing that card into here are the constituent pieces. This is a piece that actually breaks 1v1, and here's why they can't fix it, or why they can't walk away from it, and why they have to keep going more and more down this road to make more compelling EDH cards over time. I think that's the only path to win with the high standard of impossibility that you established, and you touched on it but didn't go that deeply into it. I also think, again, this is historical to date, and this question's forward-looking, but the example of like most of the Commander design sets aren't really breaking in 1v1 now. The Commanders, Legends, Commanders, whatever products, versus Modern Horizons 2, which one's making a bigger impact on Constructed. Even just giving some kind of guardrail, some cards like this card here breaks Constructed now. This, here's 5 examples. Here's, whatever it might be. It's all the initiative cards in Legacy, break Legacy, right? Because it's a mechanic designed for multiplayer.
Good example.
It's broken Legacy. The numbers have to be bigger, right? Like if the initiative cards, if that dungeon gave a card +1/+1 and then like shocked something, wouldn't break Constructed, but it lava axes because in Commander, who cares if you shock something, you wouldn't even notice, right? So it's the left side of that dungeon you get into with initiative. Why? Let's get into the weeds of like, what is it about these cards that has been pushed in a way that breaks 1v1? And then establish, and here's why that is the inevitable kind of conclusion of continued design in this space. So I think it was a very high bar already set for himself to kind of clear. I think he flirted it in a couple spots, but because of the strong construction of impossible, I think we certainly didn't get to that level. And so I'm going to go with Matt is the victor in this debate. But I think it was Ari basically, set himself up to almost impossibly be able to win given that. But I think he made some good arguments that we support the claim. And again, if you tone it down of like, it's really hard to do this.
Yeah. I
think we're getting out in a much more interesting conversation.
And I appreciate that. I talked to someone about the framing of the show. And I said, like, I was worried that people would come with like such qualified framings that they could say, if you said like Rakdos Scam is a playable deck is my take. And it's like, whereas obviously like I want people to come on and say Rakdos Scam is so good it should be banned because then we can have a real debate. So Ari, I want to start with saying I appreciate that you articulated the standard that you thought was sort of where the debate ought to be and sort of what would be interesting to talk about, because I understand if you were just trying to win a debate, you would just say, hey, and Rakdos Scam is a playable deck, or it may win a tournament next year. I mean, there's all kinds of debate topics where you're going to win. So I appreciate that. And then Tom, I appreciate your time and effort today, sort of helping, sort of supplying some arguments that maybe we missed or things that emphasis could have aided either side. So thank you both very much for coming on to take inventory. I really appreciate it. If either of you ever wants to be back on in a different seat or same seat, reach out, let me know. Happy to have you back on.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Thanks, everyone.